3 days after Frank Ward's funeral, his son placed a sealed envelope on Celia Ward's kitchen table and told her she could stay in the house for 6 months. Marcus Ward said it in the calm voice of a lawyer, explaining terms he considered generous. After 6 months, the house would pass to him if his challenge succeeded, and Celia would receive $60,000 to start over. You'd have time to make a reasonable transition, he said. Celia looked at the envelope, then at the coffee cooling beside his hand. Reasonable, she repeated. Marcus waited for the rest of her answer. There wasn't one. For 12 years, Celia had lived with a man who could make a complete decision with a nod, a shrug, or one carefully chosen word. She had learned not to mistake brevity for emptiness. Marcus had not. He folded his hands on the table and explained that Frank had signed a new will 14 months before his death, after an early Parkinson's diagnosis. The disease, the medications, the possibility of cognitive changes, all of it could give a court reason to question whether Frank had understood what he was signing. Marcus never called his father incompetent. He was too precise for that. He only said there were questions. Questions could become petitions, hearings, expert opinions, and legal bills. Celia had spent 15 years as a community health nurse, and she knew what careful language sounded like when someone wanted fear to do the work that facts could not. Marcus was not shouting. He did not threaten her. That made the pressure easier to disguise and harder to answer. When he stood to leave, he picked up his briefcase and paused beside the back door. For the first time, something in his expression slipped. I'm not trying to punish you, Celia, he said. He glanced toward the workshop behind the house, where Frank's tools still hung in exact rows. I just remember who my father was before you became the center of everything. Then he left. Celia watched the rental car disappear beyond the cottonwoods and washed both coffee cups before she touched anything else. She set them upside down on the drying rack because that was how Frank had always done it. The settlement envelope stayed where Marcus had left it. She did not open it. The house felt wrong without Frank, but not empty. His habits were everywhere. The old work gloves still hung from a nail beside the mudroom door. The left glove softened more deeply at the palm because that was the hand he trusted for grip. The blue pickup still sat a little crooked beside the fence. A dried arrangement Celia's sister had given them years earlier remained on the kitchen windowsill, brittle and faded but untouched. Frank had dusted around it every Saturday for more than a decade without ever asking why she kept it. In his truck months earlier, Celia had once found a small spiral notebook she had assumed was a parts list. Instead, it held her medical appointments, prescription refill dates, and reminders about the specialist she tended to postpone seeing. Frank had written every date down before she remembered to. She had put the notebook back and never told him she had seen it. That was how their marriage worked more often than not. He repaired the porch step before she noticed it was loose. He warmed her car on mornings when the temperature dropped below zero. He replaced the cheap reading lamp beside her chair with one that did not make her eyes ache. He almost never explained himself. He never once told her he loved her. Celia had tried not to make that absence larger than the life around it. Most days she succeeded. Once, 5 years into the marriage, she had asked him after dinner whether he ever wished he had stayed alone. Frank had looked toward the dark window over the sink, considered the question, and said, no. At the time, Celia had wanted another sentence. After he died, she kept returning to the one he gave her. The last morning Frank was home, he rose before dawn. Celia heard the scrape of his chair and the low click of the old coffee maker switching on. She stood in the bedroom doorway and watched him through the dim kitchen. His right hand trembled faintly around the mug. The tremor had been there for more than a year. He was looking through the window toward the far boundary of their property, where the tree line opened toward a gravel road that vanished into the hills. Celia assumed he was watching the October sky change color over western Montana. Frank never turned around. She went back to bed without speaking. By afternoon, he was in the hospital. He never came home again. Celia called Marcus that evening because the doctor said there might not be much time. Marcus answered from Seattle between court sessions and said he would leave as soon as he could. He did not arrive before Frank died. He did not make it to the funeral either. The small church in Cedar Bend filled only halfway, but the people who came had reasons. A rancher whose loader Frank had rebuilt after a winter breakdown sat near the back. A school custodian whose furnace motor Frank had repaired for the cost of parts stood beside the aisle. 2 brothers from a concrete company came in work jackets and left before the reception. Frank had not been a warm man in the usual sense. He was dependable. In a town that remembered who showed up when equipment failed in January, Dependability carried its own kind of affection. Celia sat in the first row beside her friend Joan Bell. Joan placed one hand over Celia's during the service and left it there without squeezing. Did not cry. She cried later, alone, when she reached for her phone to ask Frank whether he had remembered to call someone and realized there was no one left to ask. At the church, she stood straight while neighbors handed her casseroles, pies, and sentences that meant well but could not touch what had happened. Someone asked whether she was doing all right, Celia said. It was the only answer she could give without falling apart in the parking lot. The morning after Marcus's visit, Joan appeared at Celia's door with vegetable soup and a folded piece of paper. "I made you an appointment," she said. Celia unfolded the note. "Renee Caldwell, estate attorney, Thursday at 2. Frank used her," Joan added. Celia looked up. "For what?" "Apparently for more than you knew." Joan picked up her keys before Celia could object. "She called me after the funeral and said she'd been expecting you." Renee Caldwell's office sat above a small accounting firm 20 minutes north of Cedar Bend. There were no marble floors, no wall of awards, and no receptionist trained to make grief wait behind glass. There were 2 bookshelves, a worn conference table, and a pothos plant trailing from the top of a filing cabinet. Renee stood when Celia entered. She was in her mid-50s, compact, direct, and already holding a file thick enough to make Celia's stomach tighten. "Mrs. Ward, Frank asked me to make sure you understood one thing if Marcus ever challenged the estate." Celia said. Renee opened the folder but did not begin with the will. She slid a recorded deed across the table. 6 acres on Sage Creek Spur, transferred 5 years earlier. The parcel included one old half-round steel building listed as agricultural storage. The purchase price had been $11,000. The grantee line contained only one name, Celia. She read it twice. "I don't know this place." "Frank did," Renee said. The transfer had been completed years before the Parkinson's diagnosis and long before the disputed will. The property was titled directly to Celia, not to Frank's estate. "Whatever happened in probate," Renee explained. "Marcus's challenge to the will did not put that parcel inside the estate he was contesting." "Why would Frank buy me 6 acres and a rusted building without telling me?" Celia asked. Renee closed the file halfway. "He never told me why. He only cared that the deed was clean and that your name was the only one on it." For several seconds, Celia heard nothing but the baseboard heater ticking against the wall. Then she looked at the transfer date again. 5 years. Frank had been carrying this secret through 5 anniversaries, 5 winters, and a diagnosis that had changed everything. Renee reached into another envelope and placed a heavy iron key on the table. "He left this with the file." Celia stared at it. "For the building. That's my best guess." Joan drove because Celia did not trust herself to hold a conversation and keep the truck on the narrow road at the same time. Sage Creek Spur turned off the county highway and climbed between pale grass, lodgepole pine, and low rock outcrops silvered by the coming cold. The building appeared after a bend. It was not a dome exactly, but a long arched shell of corrugated steel, broad enough for several work bays and tall enough to swallow a farm truck. Rust had darkened the lower panels. Wind had lifted 2 seams along the roof. Tall grass pressed against the walls on every side. The double doors were chained shut with an old square-bodied padlock. Joan killed the engine. "Frank bought you that?" Celia held the iron key in her palm. "Apparently." She crossed the wet grass and pushed the key into the lock. At first it would not move. She braced one hand over the other and leaned her weight into it. The mechanism gave with a gritty turn. The chain slid against the door and dropped hard onto the ground. Celia pulled one door open far enough to enter. Cold air moved out of the building carrying the smell of rust, old machine oil, and dry wood. The interior was almost dark. She could make out empty shelving along the curved walls and a covered welding unit in one corner. At the far end stood a heavy workbench. For reasons she could not explain, the bench looked less abandoned than everything around it. Its top was bare and clean beneath a film of dust that covered the floor and shelves. Celia stayed in the doorway. She was not ready to go farther. Behind her, Joan did not urge her. They closed the doors again and drove home before sunset. The certified letter from the probate court arrived the following Monday. Marcus had filed a formal challenge to Frank's will, alleging that the disease and treatment might have impaired Frank's testamentary capacity when he signed it. A second filing disputed ownership of several machines and specialty tools from Frank's home workshop. Marcus argued that the will had not named them item by item. Renee called before Celia finished reading. "The capacity claim is the real case," she said. "The equipment claim is leverage." Celia sat at the kitchen table with a yellow pad and wrote down every phrase that mattered. She had learned in healthcare that frightening words became smaller once they were turned into dates, names, tasks, and questions. How strong is his case? Strong enough to survive the opening stage. Not strong enough to prove without evidence that Frank actually lacked capacity. And strong enough to cost money? Renee was quiet for half a beat. Yes. That answer mattered more than the others. Celia wrote it down too. The next 2 weeks wore on her in ways the paperwork did not. Paper could be sorted. People could not. At Salter Hardware, Wes Salter looked up when Celia came through the door, and then busied himself with a display of drill bits before their eyes met. The couple across the road stopped lifting a hand from their porch when she drove by. Joan finally told her what she had heard at the grocery store. People were saying Marcus had been pushed aside after Frank remarried. They were saying Celia had not grown up in Cedar Bend. They were saying Frank had changed his will while he was sick. Each statement contained a fact and an accusation woven together so tightly that separating them required more patience than gossip ever deserved. Celia had moved to the area at 44. She had married Frank a year later. She had spent 4 years adjusting his medications, driving him to neurology appointments, and cutting meat when his hand would not cooperate. On the worst days, he sat in the shop because he could no longer trust himself with a grinder. None of that made her local. She understood the arithmetic. Marcus had 40 years of family history in the county. She had 12 years of marriage and no talent for campaigning on her own behalf. At night, Celia spread the probate papers across the kitchen table and worked through the numbers. Saving, insurance proceeds, monthlies, Renee's retainer, the estimated cost if the case dragged on for months. She circled the things she could control and drew a line through the things she could not. If she lost everything inside the estate, she would still have 6 acres and the steel building on Sage Creek Spur. That was not security, but it was ground beneath her feet. Renee called after 9 one evening. Marcus had retained a neuropsychologist who had reviewed Frank's records without ever treating him. The expert's preliminary opinion said Parkinson's at Frank's stage could, in some patients, affect planning, judgment, and executive function. Celia put her pencil down. She said, "That's the word," Renee answered. "It's a useful word when you don't have did." They needed Frank's treating neurologist, Dr. Samuel Ortega. He had retired the previous year and moved out of Montana. The clinic that once employed him had forwarded Renee's request, but would not give out his personal information. "We need someone who can speak to Frank, not Parkinson's in the abstract," Renee said. Celia looked toward the mudroom, where Frank's gloves still hung from the nail. "I'll find him." After the call, she could not make herself go to bed. She drove to Sage Creek Spur instead. It was after 10 when she stopped before the final bend, where the building remained hidden behind the trees. She shut off the engine and sat in darkness with both hands on the wheel. The pressure of the case, the town, the money, and the empty house settled on her all at once. She let it. For 10 minutes she did not solve anything. Then she started the truck and went home. Saturday morning she returned alone. This time she brought work gloves, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee. She unlocked the double doors and pulled them wide. Daylight entered through gaps in the roof and cut narrow white bands across the concrete floor. The building was larger than she had understood on the first visit. The arched ceiling rose above an open floor roughly 40 feet long with enough width for workstations along both sides and a clear aisle down the middle. Celia walked slowly past the empty steel shelving and the covered welding unit. The concrete had cracks but no serious heaving. The frame showed surface corrosion, not collapse. Frank would have noticed the difference. At the far end she reached the workbench. It was built from thick timber on a welded steel base. Celia set her thermos down and placed both palms on the top. The bench did not shift. A broad drawer ran beneath the work surface. A small wooden latch held it closed. Celia lifted the latch and pulled. Inside stood 7 rolled sets of drawings, each tied with plain cotton cord and arranged upright from left to right. Not dumped, not forgotten, filed. She took out the first roll and spread it across the bench. It was a floor plan for the building. Frank's handwriting filled the margins with measurements and short construction notes. But the drawing did not show a storage shed. It showed a working metal shop, ventilated welding stations along one side, 3 teaching benches down the center, locked storage at the rear, a small office and break room in the back corner. Accessible clearance had been marked around the main aisle and entry. Celia leaned closer. Frank had planned the place as if he expected other people to use it. The second roll listed equipment, suppliers, estimated costs, and replacement priorities. The third laid out a renovation schedule beginning with roof reinforcement, then electrical work, interior framing, ventilation, and tool installation. The proposed start month was April. Frank had died in March. Celia felt the first real break in her concentration. She returned to the floor plan and found the title block in the lower corner. Franklin J. Beneath his name was a date from 2 years before his death. Celia counted backward. The plan predated the first tremor she had noticed by months and the Parkinson's diagnosis by more than a year. Whatever this project was, Frank had not invented it after he became sick. He had been building toward it while both of them still believed they had time. Celia sat in the plain wooden chair behind the bench. She had come looking for information. What she found was intention. The tears arrived without warning and without drama. She covered her mouth with one hand and let them come, because there was no one there to reassure. Wind pressed against the curved steel shell and moved on. The building held. So did the bench beneath her hand. On Monday, Celia began looking for Dr. Ortega the way she used to track down missing records for patients who had been transferred between clinics. She started with the medical group that had employed him, then called neurology practices, rehabilitation centers, rural clinics, and specialist networks across the region. She did not ask anyone to violate privacy rules. She left messages, explained the legal need, and asked that her number be forwarded if someone still had professional contact with him. 11 calls produced nothing. The second day produced a retired physician with the same last name and a receptionist who was certain she remembered Ortega but did not. On the third day, a scheduling coordinator at a small clinic in Coeur d'Alene paused after Celia gave Frank's name. Dr. Ortega consults here twice a month, the woman said. Celia closed her eyes for 1 second. Would you please ask him to call me? He called 40 minutes later. His voice was older than Celia remembered, but the dry humor was the same. Frank Ward, he said immediately. The man who made me explain every medication until he could repeat the reason back to me. Celia almost laughed. That was him. She told Ortega about the will challenge and the outside expert's use of the word could. Ortega listened without interrupting. Then he said he had documented cognitive screening, functional status, medication response, and decision-making at every relevant visit. Frank's motor symptoms had progressed. His thinking had not shown the decline Marcus's expert was suggesting. I can speak to the period when he signed the will, Ortega said. His capacity was intact. I wrote that in the chart at the time, and I'll state it under oath now. Celia pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. Thank you. Send me the date and your attorney's contact information, he said. Then thank the records, not me. Frank made sure I had enough of them. Renee called that evening after receiving Ortega's preliminary statement. For the first time since the case began, her voice carried something close to relief. This shifts the center of the case, she said. She also explained that Marcus's machinery claim was weaker than she had first wanted to say over the phone. Frank's will contained a broad residuary provision giving Celia all property not otherwise specifically distributed. The argument over unnamed tools was unlikely to survive serious review. His lawyer knows that, Renee said. They were testing whether you knew it. Celia looked at Marcus's unopened settlement envelope, still lying on the far end of the table. So the second claim was pressure, mostly, and the first one, still real enough to create delay. Ortega gives us strong evidence, but Marcus can keep asking for more review, more records, more time. Celia thought of the 7 drawing rolls at Sage Creek Spur. What if Frank left something else? Renee did not answer immediately. If he did, we need to know what it is before we decide what it means. The next morning, Celia went back to the steel building with a flashlight and the methodical patience that had made her a good nurse. She started at the left wall and moved clockwise. Every shelf, every cabinet, the covered welding unit, the floor edges, the wall brackets. She found old equipment, spare fasteners, a box of welding lenses, and a maintenance log from the previous owner. Nothing that changed the case. She saved the workbench for last. Celia had already opened the wide drawer with the plans, but something about the bench bothered her. It was too heavily built to waste space. She crouched and ran the flashlight along the underside of the steel frame. Set back behind the front crosspiece was a second drawer no deeper than 2 inches. It had no handle. A shallow notch along the lower edge was the only way to pull it open. Inside lay one brown document envelope. Frank had written a single name across the front, Marcus. Celia stayed crouched for several seconds with one hand on the drawer. The envelope belonged to Frank's son in every sense that mattered. She could imagine a dozen reasons to open it and only one reason not to. It was not addressed to her. She took it home and called Renee. Don't break the seal, Renee said. Bring it here tomorrow. Snow began overnight, the first light dusting of the season. By morning, the courthouse lawn and parking lot were white at the edges, though the pavement still showed through. Renee examined the envelope in her office, photographed its condition, and opened it in front of Celia. Inside was one page in Frank's small block handwriting. Renee read it once, then a second time. Her face changed very little. She handed the page to Celia. Frank began by telling Marcus that he had failed him in ways he understood too late. He wrote that work had often been easier for him than fatherhood, because machines did not need explanations after you had disappointed them. He acknowledged that the end of his first marriage had left Marcus trying to decide who was to blame. Frank said Marcus had been a child and should never have been made to carry that question. Then the letter turned to Celia. Frank wrote that his choices after remarriage had been his own. No one had taken his property, his loyalty, or his attention from him. He had decided where to put them. He asked Marcus not to confuse being hurt by a father's choices with being robbed by the person who later received them. Near the bottom, Frank wrote that obligation and generosity were not the same thing. A man could fail to meet one obligation and still have the right to make another gift freely. He hoped Marcus would learn the difference before anger cost him more than the estate ever could. The letter ended without a plea for forgiveness. It ended with Frank's name. Celia lowered the page. For a moment she could see Marcus at 8 or 10 or 12, long before she knew him. She could see a boy waiting for a father who kept choosing work because work did not ask him to speak. That did not excuse what Frank had failed to give his son. It explained something Celia had not allowed herself to consider. Frank's silence had not only been difficult for her. Marcus had been living with an older version of the same silence for decades. Renee tapped the edge of the paper gently. This matters legally. Celia looked at her. Because of what it says. Because of how it says it. The reasoning is organized. The memory is specific. The judgment is coherent. It undercuts the claim that he could not make deliberate decisions. Renee paused. With Dr. Ortega's records and this, the capacity argument gets much harder. Celia looked back at the envelope with Marcus's name on it. Frank didn't write this for a judge. No, he wrote it because he knew he might not get another chance with his son. Renee took off her glasses. What do you want me to do with it? Celia folded the page along its original creases. Nothing yet. Celia, if we can defend the will without using this, we do. Renee studied her for a moment and nodded. Then we hold it unless the case forces the issue. Celia slipped the page back into its envelope. And after the case, Marcus gets it. That night, Celia read Dr. Ortega's statement twice at the kitchen table. She read Renee's motion, the will, the deed to Sage Creek Spur, and the list of disputed equipment. Marcus's letter sat apart from the case file. She could have moved it into the stack. She did not. At 11, she put on her coat and drove to the steel building. The road was white in patches where the snow had held in shadow. Celia stood outside the doors with a flashlight and wondered whether she had turned the building into something it was not. Maybe grief had made every hidden drawer feel like a message. Maybe Frank had left plans because he liked plans. Maybe there was no final answer waiting for her. She went in anyway. Instead of searching the hidden drawer again, Celia opened the wide drawer and removed the 4 rolls she had not yet examined. The first showed electrical service and lighting placement. The second contained ventilation details and material specifications. The third laid out a sequence for inspections, equipment delivery, and interior finishing. The fourth was thinner than the rest. Celia untied it and began to unroll the paper. A folded sheet slipped from inside the coil and landed near her wrist. Her name was written on the outside. Celia. She stopped breathing for a second. Then she opened it. Frank wrote about the first day they met at the community clinic. He had arrived with a metal sliver buried in the heel of his hand, irritated that bleeding had interrupted his work. Celia had cleaned the wound, removed the fragment, and closed it while asking only the questions she needed answered. 3 days later, Frank had returned for a wound check with a paper sack of pears from a neighbor's orchard. Celia had assumed the pears were a thank you. Frank wrote that they were also an excuse to see her again. He admitted he had spent 12 years expecting her to understand things he should have said plainly. He wrote that building, repairing, remembering appointments, and making a place useful for her had felt more honest to him than saying words he did not know how to carry afterward. Then he wrote the words Celia had stopped expecting from him years earlier. I loved you. He had underlined nothing. There was no flourish. The sentence sat in the middle of the page as simply as a measurement. Below it, Frank added that he was sorry he had trusted actions to translate everything. Some things, he wrote, should not make the person you love do all the translating. Celia read that line again. Then she read the whole page from the beginning. The steel building was silent except for the wind pushing against the roof. Celia placed one hand on the workbench because her knees had gone weak. For years she had told herself that asking for words would have been unfair to Frank, because words were not his way. Now, after death had made the conversation one-sided forever, Frank himself had told her that was only partly true. His actions had been love. His silence had also had a cost. Both things could be true at once. Celia folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her coat against her chest. She did not cry as hard as she had the first time she found the plans. This grief felt different, not small, less unfinished. Outside, snow had begun again, fine and dry in the headlights. Marcus's envelope lay on the passenger seat where Celia had brought it without thinking. She looked at it before starting the truck. Renee had Dr. Ortega. They had the contemporaneous medical record. They had the deed and the will. They had enough to stand in court without turning a private letter from a father into a legal weapon against his son. Celia started the engine. For the first time since Frank died, enough felt like a meaningful word. The probate hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a county courtroom smaller than Celia had imagined. There were fluorescent lights, rows of wooden chairs, and a judge who wore reading glasses low on her nose and did not seem interested in anyone's performance. Judge Catherine Ames had a legal pad in front of her and a habit of waiting long enough after a lawyer stopped speaking to make sure he was actually finished. Marcus sat beside local counsel in a dark suit. He did not look towards Celia when she entered. Renee placed a thin folder in front of Celia. Ortega's affidavit, certified chart excerpts, the will execution file, and the residuary clause, she whispered. That's what we're using. Celia touched the brown envelope inside her handbag. Nothing else. Nothing else. Marcus's attorney presented the challenge carefully. He emphasized diagnosis, medication changes, tremor progression, and the general possibility that Parkinson's could affect executive function. He cited the reviewing expert's concern that disease progression may have influenced complex legal decisions. Renee did not argue with Parkinson's in general. She argued about Frank. She walked the court through Dr. Ortega's treatment dates, cognitive screenings, appointment notes, medication discussions, and functional assessments. She pointed out that Frank had asked detailed questions, understood risks and alternatives, and made consistent decisions across the same period in which he executed the will. Then she submitted Ortega's conclusion that Frank showed no evidence of impaired legal decision-making capacity during the relevant months. Judge Ames read the affidavit herself. The room became so quiet that Celia could hear someone shifting papers in the clerk's office beyond the side door. After several minutes, the judge looked over her glasses at Marcus's attorney. Your expert describes what the disease can do in some patients, she said. She tapped Ortega's affidavit once. The treating neurologist describes what he observed in this patient. The attorney began to explain that both forms of evidence deserved consideration. They, Judge Ames said, but they are not the same evidence. She asked whether Marcus had any contemporaneous record showing confusion, disorientation, memory failure, inability to understand property, or inability to identify the people affected by the will. His attorney asked for a brief recess. The judge granted 20 minutes. Celia sat on a hallway bench with her coat across her knees, while Renee met Marcus's counsel near the elevators. Through the glass at the end of the corridor, snowmelt dripped steadily from the courthouse roof. Celia did not watch the lawyers' faces for clues. She looked at the brown envelope in her bag and kept it there. Renee returned before the recess ended. They're withdrawing the will challenge. Celia stared at her. All of it. The capacity petition and the equipment claim. The estate will be administered under Frank's will. Celia hailed slowly. There was no rush of triumph. Mostly, there was room in her body where tension had been living. Are you sure? Renee smiled for the first time that morning. I'm very sure. The lawyers filed the withdrawal before noon. Marcus came out of the conference room carrying his coat over one arm. He started toward the exit without looking at Celia. She stood. Marcus. He stopped. Celia walked across the hallway and removed the brown envelope from her bag. Your father wrote this for you. Marcus looked at his own name in Frank's handwriting. For several seconds, he did not reach for it. Then he took the envelope with both hands. Celia noticed that more than anything else. Renee and I read it because of the case, she said. We did not use it. Marcus's eyes moved from the envelope to her face. Why not? Because it wasn't written to beat you. His jaw tightened. Celia could see the lawyer in him searching for the hidden advantage in her answer. There wasn't one. It's yours, she said. Marcus looked down again. He did not thank her. Celia did not ask him to. She put on her coat and left the courthouse before he opened the envelope. The afternoon air was sharp enough to sting her lungs. She stood beside her truck for a moment, looking at the mountains beyond the county buildings. Then she called Vince Barlow. Wes Salter had given her his number a week earlier when Celia asked who still did structural work on old metal buildings. Vince was 59, a welder and general contractor who had spent most of his life repairing barns, shops, and agricultural structures across the county. He had known Frank for more than 20 years. He met Celia at Sage Creek Spur 2 days later. Before entering the building, Vince walked the full exterior perimeter. He pushed on panels, examined fasteners, looked along the foundation line, and climbed halfway up a ladder to inspect the roof seam. Only then did he come inside. Celia had spread all 7 drawing sets across the workbench. Vince read the floor plan first, then the electrical layout, then the ventilation notes. He went back to the floor plan and checked 2 measurements against the existing structure with his tape. Both matched. Frank drew these. Everyone. Vince rubbed his thumb over the edge of the paper without touching the pencil marks. He was planning a training shop. Celia nodded. That's what it looks like. Not just his shop. Vince pointed to the 3 center benches and the clearance around them. He expected students. Celia thought of Frank watching that direction from the kitchen on his last morning home. I know. Vince stood silently for another minute. Then he folded his tape measure and clipped it back to his belt. If you're going to finish it, we start with the roof. That's what his schedule says. Then his schedule is right. Work began the next Monday. Vince brought 2 men who arrived before 7 and treated Frank's drawings as instructions rather than memorial objects. They stabilized the roof seams first, replaced only the panels that had failed beyond repair, and sealed the rest. They repaired flashing, reinforced 2 frame connections, and added weatherproofing where water had been tracking down the inside wall. For 1 full day, the building seemed darker than before because the old shafts of daylight disappeared. Then the new electrical service went live. Rows of bright industrial fixtures followed the curve of the ceiling and turned the abandoned shell into a room with purpose. Celia came in after sunset just to see it lit. The clean light revealed every rust stain, every patched panel, and every flaw in the concrete. She liked that. Nothing had been disguised. It had simply been made usable again. Word spread through Cedar Bend without Celia doing anything to spread it. Wes Salter changed the price on a supply invoice and pretended he had not. When Celia pointed to the difference, he turned toward a shelf of fasteners. Contractor rate, he said. I'm not a contractor. Talk to Vince. That was the entire conversation. A retired rancher named Lloyd Barrett arrived one morning with a compact tractor and spent 6 hours grading the muddy approach to the building. Celia tried to pay him. He waved her off without shutting down the engine. Frank got my generator running during the ice storm of 18. We're even. The minister's wife left a foil-covered pan of enchiladas on Vince's tailgate one Saturday and drove away before anyone could stop her. 2 men from the concrete company donated half a day to repair the threshold at the main doors. Joan watched the activity from outside with a paper cup of coffee. They're apologizing, she said. Celia looked at Wes's discounted invoice, tractor marks, and the fresh concrete drying across the threshold. Without having to say it, Joan smiled sideways. You sound like Frank. Celia almost answered that this was the problem. Instead, she smiled back. The week after the hearing, Celia mailed Marcus's settlement envelope to his attorney's office. It was still sealed. She put it inside a larger envelope without a note. There was nothing she needed to say about it. 3 weeks into the renovation, Vince came through the main doors while Celia was marking wall space for tool racks. There's a car down by the bend, he said. Celia looked past him. A dark rental sedan sat at the edge of Sage Creek Spur with the engine running. Marcus was behind the wheel. He had parked far enough away that coming closer would have required a decision. Celia returned to her measurements. From the corner of her eye, she could see him through the open doors. His phone lit up once on the passenger seat. Then again. He looked down but did not pick it up. He stayed for nearly an hour. He never got out. Celia did not walk toward him. When she looked again, the road was empty. She told no one he had been there. Some encounters did not become more real because they were discussed. The renovation lasted a little more than 3 months. Frank's measurements saved days of correction. Vince checked them often enough to become irritated by how consistently they matched the building. He left no room for me to improve his math, he complained one morning. Celia knew that was prey. The roof held heat by early December. The concrete was repaired and sealed. 3 heavy teaching benches were built to Frank's dimensions and set down the center aisle. Vince added a fourth small station near the rear wall after deciding the room could handle it. He did not put the extra lumber on the invoice. Celia did not mention that she had noticed. The ventilation system went in over the welding bays. Locking cabinets filled the rear storage wall. The small office received a desk, a used sofa, a first aid cabinet, and the reading lamp from beside Celia's chair at home. Frank had bought it for her. She decided it belonged here. Celia arranged the tools herself. Wrenches, clamps by function, measuring tools on the higher rack, protective equipment near the entrance where no one could claim they had not seen it. She hung Frank's hammer last. The hickory handle had been worn smooth by his grip. She placed it on a hook near the main work area, not behind glass and not above anyone's head. It was a tool. Frank would have hated a shrine. Outside, Vince mounted a simple steel sign above the doors. Ward Metalworks. Celia had argued for a name that did not include the family. Vince ignored her. His drawings, he said. Your building, your call after I leave. She left the sign where it was. 2 weeks before the planned opening, a 17-year-old girl appeared in the doorway just after 8 in the morning. Celia recognized her as Vince's daughter, Tessa Barlow. Tessa wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled twice at the wrists and work boots that were cleaner than she probably wanted them to look. Vince's truck idled near the road. He had not come inside with her. My dad said you might take apprentices, Tessa said. Celia leaned against the doorframe. What do you know about welding? Not enough. That's not what I asked. Tessa swallowed. I can run a grinder safely. I can measure. I know basic shop rules. I've watched Dad, but he won't teach me unless I'm in a real program. Celia glanced toward Vince's truck. Smart. Tessa's mouth almost moved into a smile. I asked at a fabrication shop over in Mill Crossing. They said they weren't set up for beginners. Celia heard what the girl did not say. Maybe the shop truly had no place for a beginner. Maybe it had no place for that beginner. The difference did not need to be decided at the doorway. Celia said. 7 in the morning. Safety glasses, cotton clothes, hair tied back. If you're late, you go home. Tessa straightened. I'll be here. She nodded once and walked back to the truck. Vince did not wave from the driver's seat. He simply put the truck in gear and drove away. Celia stood in the open doorway and remembered a paper sack of pears on a clinic desk 12 years earlier. The night before Ward Metalworks opened, Celia went to the building alone. She left the overhead lights off. Late December daylight entered low through the open doors and stretched across the polished floor. The benches were ready. The welding curtains were hung. The ventilation system had passed inspection. The tool racks were full. Frank's hammer waited on its hook. Celia walked the entire room slowly. At the main workbench, she put her hand on the timber top and felt the same stubborn solidity she had felt the first day she found the drawings. Frank had planned this place before illness made time feel scarce. He had deeded it to her before either of them knew it would become protection. He had left letters because at the end even Frank understood that work could not carry every sentence by itself. Celia took his letter from the inside pocket of her coat. She no longer carried it every day, but she had brought it tonight. The folds were softening at the edges. She did not read it again. She knew what it said. She returned it to her pocket and locked the doors behind her. The next morning, Tessa arrived at 6:58. Celia had been there since 6:30 with coffee and Frank's original floor plan spread across the bench. At 7 exactly, she opened the door. Tessa entered and stopped just inside. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the benches, the bright work lights, the welding bay, the tool wall, and the clear aisle down the center. She noticed Frank's hammer but did not ask about it. Celia handed her safety glasses. We start with stance and control, not spark. Tessa put on the glasses. Okay. Celia set a short piece of flat bar on the anvil. She showed Tessa where to place her feet and how to keep her shoulders loose. The hammer should travel through the whole motion, Celia explained, instead of being forced from the elbow. If your arm is doing all the work, your aim will fall apart before the metal does, Celia said. She demonstrated one strike. The ring traveled upward into the curved roof and returned softer. Tessa listened to the echo. Again. Your turn. The first strike landed too close to the edge. Celia said nothing. Tessa reset her feet and tried again. The second was better. By mid-morning, she had learned how quickly steel punished impatience. Celia taught her to watch color, surface, and resistance instead of fighting the material because she wanted it to move faster. Heat changes what the steel will accept, Celia said. Pay attention before you add force. Tessa nodded and adjusted her angle. She made mistakes without arguing with the correction. She asked specific questions. When she did not understand, she said so. Celia liked that more than confidence. Near noon, Celia reached for Frank's hammer without thinking. She lifted it from the hook and held it out handle first. "Try this one." Tessa took it carefully. The hammer was heavier than the practice tool and balanced closer to the head. She rolled the handle once in her palm, feeling where it wanted to settle. Celia almost told her whose it had been. She decided not. Tessa found her stance, raised the hammer, and brought it down. The strike landed clean. Steel answered steel with a sharp, full note that filled the arched building. Tessa looked at Celia, waiting. Celia gave one small nod. It was the kind of nod Frank had used when a measurement was right, and no further discussion was required. Tessa reset the metal for another strike. Outside, winter sun caught the simple steel sign over the doors. Inside, the shop was warm enough for coats to come off. The ventilation fans hummed above the welding bays, and a 17-year-old apprentice was learning to make something with her own hands. The sound from the anvil rose into the roof and faded more slowly than Celia expected. She listened until it was gone. Frank's silence had once made Celia wonder whether love was present at all. By the time she stood in the finished shop, she understood a more complicated truth. Care can be real even when it is expressed badly. A repaired step, a remembered appointment, a deed placed quietly in one person's name, or a building planned years in advance can carry enormous devotion. But devotion does not erase the burden placed on someone who must spend years guessing what those acts mean. Frank had loved Celia through work because work was the language he trusted most. He had also left Marcus with wounds shaped by the same habit of withholding words. That mattered. It would be easy to turn Frank's quietness into a virtue simply because his intentions were good. The story does not support that simple conclusion. His reliability gave people safety, but his emotional restraint also created uncertainty for the two people closest to him. Celia's final understanding was not that words are unnecessary. It was that actions and words solve different problems. Actions can prove commitment over time. Words can remove doubts that no amount of private interpretation should have to carry alone. Marcus was wrong to turn grief and resentment into a legal pressure campaign against Celia. He was not wrong to have been hurt by a father who had been difficult to reach long before Celia entered the family. Celia was right to defend what Frank left her. She was also right not to use Marcus's private letter when the case could be won without it. Winning did not require taking every available advantage. That choice protected a boundary Frank himself had failed to protect often enough in life. The strongest part of Celia's victory was not the estate or the building. It was that she refused to let fear decide what kind of person she would become while defending them. She organized the facts, found the doctor, learned what the plans meant, and used only what she needed. Then she turned a private gift into a place where someone else could gain a skill and a future. That did not make grief useful or justify the years of uncertainty. It simply meant Celia chose what to do with what remained. Love shown through labor deserves to be recognized. Love that can speak should also speak while the other person is still there to hear it.